Hello everyone, and welcome to a look back at writing Excursion engines. If you recall from the last video, I opened up to start taking your guys' suggestions again, and even made a little competition out of it. Well, when it was all said and done, it was Grand Drunk Western's suggestion that ended up taking the victory, so thank you to Grand Drunk Western for suggesting this video. Now, before we get into the big four locomotives that you all already know, we have to start off on the smaller side of the locomotive scale. That's right, our first locomotive is number 1187. 1187 is an 040 switch engine built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1903. As you may have already noticed, the 1187 was built with a unique camelback design, in which the cab of the locomotive and the engineer's compartment is built over the middle of the boiler, while the fireman works on the rear backhead where the cab would normally be located. The 1187 turned out this way because the locomotive burns anthracite coal, which requires a much larger firebox to burn properly, and because of this, the cab of the locomotive could no longer fit on the backhead, so it was moved forward. The design itself had varying degrees of success, but I digress. During its career in revenue service, the 1187 was primarily used as a switch engine in various yards across the system. The locomotive enjoyed a nice long career on the Reading. However, as larger modes of switching power became available, the 1187 was slowly pushed aside and eventually retired and sold in 1946 to the E&G Brook Iron Company in Birdsboro, Pennsylvania. Once there, the 1187 was renumbered to simply number 4, and from 1946 on until 1962, the locomotive continued out its duties as a switch engine. After larger modes of switching power and now diesels had yet again encroached on the 1187's duties, it was sold to the Strasburg Railroad in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1962. After steaming to Lancaster under her own power, the 1187 would immediately enter a tourist train service on the Strasburg Railroad, pulling passengers across the 4-mile short line. While the locomotive's new life on the Strasburg started out great, after a few years it was very apparent that the locomotive was not up to the task of pulling the heavy tourist trains, and that those trains would only keep growing in size and weight as the years went on. And so, in 1967, the 1187 steamed on the Strasburg Railroad for the last time. After being removed from tourist train service, the 1187 will be moved around the Strasburg Railroad Shop Complex as well as the neighboring Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania being placed on display. However, little to no effort was made to keep the locomotive in good condition, so it began deteriorating as the years went on. Thankfully, the locomotive was saved, as it was purchased by the Age of Steam Roundhouse in Sugar Creek, Ohio in August of 2020 and moved there for a cosmetic restoration. As of today, the locomotive continues to sit in the roundhouse, awaiting its turn in the back shop eagerly, and it can still be admired by the guests that frequently tour the Age of Steam Roundhouse. Now, with 1187 out of the way, we can finally move on to the big four. Our next set of locomotives are Reading 2100, 2101, 2102, and 2124. All four of these locomotives were originally built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in the mid-1920s as I-10 SA Class 280 consolidations, as numbers 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2044. Because of wartime demands, 30 of these 280 consolidations would enter the Reading shops in 1945, and emerge as the T1 Class 484s that we know them as today. By the mid-1950s, however, the T1s were already being retired and sold off for scrap in favor of diesel power. Not wanting steam to go out quietly, the Reading Railroad decided to keep 2100, 2101, 2123, and 2124 as part of their brand new Iron Horse Rambles excursion program, better known as the Reading Rambles. The program would kick off in 1959 and was an immediate hit between passengers and rail fans alike. 2100 and 2124 would be used for the majority of the motive power on these trips, with 2101 being kept as a spare engine and 2123 being cannibalized for parts, eventually being scrapped in 1966. The first of the Iron Horse Rambles to be retired would be 2124 in 1963 after its flue time expired. Following its retirement, the locomotive would be sold to F. Nelson Blunt for his Steamtown, USA collection in North Walpole, New Hampshire. In the mid-1980s, the locomotive would be moved along with the rest of the collection to Scranton, Pennsylvania, where it remains on display today. Not wanting 2124's shoes to go unfilled, the Reading decided to bring in locomotive number 2102 and restore it to operation for use on the Iron Horse Rambles. Prior to this, the 2102 had been serving as a stationary boiler providing power to the Carpenter Steel Corporation. Unfortunately, the Iron Horse Rambles wouldn't last much longer after this, for in 1964 the program was concluded, and by early 1965 the remaining locomotives had been sold off. Numbers 2100 and 2101 will be sold off to the Strigel Scrapyard in Baltimore, Maryland, while 2102 would be sold to Steam Tours Incorporated in Akron, Ohio. In 1966, the 2102 would become the first of the Reading T1s to return to operation, and would go on to pull a number of excursions across the eastern portion of the United States. The locomotive would unfortunately be sidelined for a number of years after sustaining damage to its lubrication system during a minor derailment in 1968. The locomotive would return to service in 1971. 2 years later, in 1973, the 2102 would undergo a number of cosmetic changes and was renumbered to Delaware and Hudson number 302 as a means of helping celebrate the sesquicentennial of the Delaware and Hudson Railway. Throughout 1973, the locomotive would make a number of special trips throughout the Northeast in Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, even double-heading with Canadian Pacific 462 number 1278, which was also masquerading as a D&H engine. Following the 1973 operating season, the 2102 was sold yet again, this time to the Allegheny Railroad. Immediately following this purchase, the 2102 would go down for a multi-year overhaul. While the 2102 was down for overhaul, locomotives 2100 and 2101 were saved from the scrapyard by none other than Ross Rowland and the High Iron Company. In 1975, Rowland purchased both locomotives for use on his upcoming American Freedom Train project, with 2101 being restored to operation and 2100 being used as a spare parts engine. After a remarkable 30-day-long restoration, the 2101 emerged from the shops reborn as American Freedom Train No. 1. The 2101 was tasked with pulling the American Freedom Train across the majority of the eastern section of the United States before handing the train off to Southern Pacific 4449 in Chicago. Following the conclusion of the Freedom Train at the end of 1976, the 2101 was once again placed into storage. In 1977, the 2102 would emerge from its multi-year-long restoration and embarked on a number of excursions with Grand Trunk Western No. 4070 over Horseshoe Curve. Meanwhile, in 1979, the 2101 was brought out of storage for use on the Chessie Steam Special to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and as such was given an all-new paint scheme. While at first the train was very successful, the 2101's excursion career would be tragically cut short later that year after sustaining major damage in a roundhouse fire while being stored in Russell, Kentucky. In 1981, a trade was made between the High Iron Company and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. In turn, the High Iron Company got Chesapeake and Ohio No. 614 for use on the rest of the Chessie Steam Special, and the museum got 2101, which was then cosmetically restored to American Freedom Train No. 1 and placed on display, where the locomotive currently remains today. Jumping back to the 2102, in 1985 the locomotive was under the lease of the Reading Company Technical and Historical Society. In September of that year, it made an appearance at the ex-Reading shops to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Reading T1 Class. Also in attendance for this event was Blue Mountain and Reading Railroad No. 425. While at the event, the owner of the Blue Mountain and Reading Railroad, Andrew Muller, cut a deal with the Historical Society and purchased the 2102 for himself. Following this, the 2102 made a number of special trips and excursion runs to the Blue Mountain and Reading Railroad over the years, until August of 1991 when the locomotive was taken out of service once again for an overhaul. This would ultimately be the last time the 2102 was ever steamed up for a number of years. But where was the 2100 during all of this? Well, after going through a multitude of owners throughout the back end of the 20th century and some test runs on the Ohio Central in 1998, the locomotive was converted to burn oil and was in the hands of the Golden Pacific Railroad in Tacoma, Washington. After 2 lackluster operating seasons in 2006 and 2007, the locomotive was pulled from service and placed in storage after the closure of the Golden Pacific Railroad. Thankfully, in early 2015, the American Steam Railroad leased the locomotive with the intent to restore her to operation, and was moved to their roundhouse in Cleveland, Ohio later that year. As of today, that restoration is still ongoing. As for the 2102, that locomotive's restoration is also still ongoing, and in early January of 2021, the locomotive was test-fired for the first time in decades. And that's going to do it for a look back at Reading excursion engines. If you have any suggestions or constructive criticisms, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'd like to thank you all for your continued support of this series over the years. If you have suggestions for videos that I should do outside of this series, also feel free to leave those in the comment section below. And once again, I'd like to thank Grand Trunk Western for suggesting this video in the first place. That's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching.